So we've talked through a plan. We've talked about some of the things that you should consider, some strategic measures. Finally, let's start talking about some of the things that you're going to want to do as you prepare for your upgrade of Liferay. So again, the process is a pretty big process, right? There's a lot of things that are going to be going on, a lot of planning, a lot of trial, a lot of error, just a whole lot. So it can seem like a very daunting task. But really, we can kind of break this up into a couple of different steps. And we're going to first start talking about two big steps, right? First one is going to be upgrading Liferay itself and kind of everything that follows along with that. And secondly, we're going to be talking about upgrading the database. Again, in the previous video, we said, yeah, the database is really going to be somewhat of the nucleus. A lot of what we need, a lot of what we're going to be doing will revolve around a successful database upgrade. So Liferay database is going to kind of be the big two. Now, before we touch anything, before we progress through and try to upgrade, we must always make sure that we have a backup of everything that we're going to be touching. A backup of code, a backup of our database, a backup of our Liferay production environment. Anything that we need to back up, we must. Again, classic saying is a backup is not a backup unless you can restore from it. Now, if you're coming from an older version, we're talking like before 6.2, then you can't go straight to DXP. You're gonna have to do a little bit more. You're gonna have to go from 6.1 to 6.2 or 6.0 to 6.2. 6.2 is sort of the last stop before the DXP world. So you gotta make it to 6.2 first before you can go to DXP. Luckily for us, again, as long as you have your backups, you're gonna be fine. So I'm assuming that you do. So we listed off a couple of things. Let's be a little bit more formal about it. What are some of the things that you should back up? Of course, your Liferay database, right? You gotta have that since that's gonna be sort of the nucleus. A lot of what we're gonna do is around that. You're gonna want the Liferay file system, right? If you can get the whole directory of Liferay home, by all means grab it, right? Make sure that you have a backup of your documents and media, just in case, and your property files, so your portal ext and your portal setup wizard.properties. And of course, any custom code or any source code that you went through. Since we're going to be touching that quite extensively, you want to make sure that you have that backed up. Otherwise, it'd be sad days if you modify something, it doesn't work, and you're trying to go back to start, but you have nothing to go back to. So Liferay home, you are probably quite aware of Liferay home, right? That's where a lot of things reside. You're going to have your configuration files, portal ext and portal setup wizard. You're going to have your Liferay plugins over in the Liferay home directory. You're going to have, depending on your configuration, you might have, I should say, your document library and your search indexes in your Liferay home as well. Typically, your database is, of course, elsewhere, right? It's MySQL, SQL Server, so on. All of that to say, if possible, backup Liferay home. Let's start with the database. A lot of the important stuff is going to be in our database. So this will always be first. This is always what's going to be stressed the most. So depending on how you want to do it, you can either back up the live database, right? Or you can export it or dump it depending on your terminology, which database you're using. So whatever means that you have to take, just make sure that you take it. Again, you also want to make sure that you can restore from that dump or from the backup of the live database, right? Always want to make sure about that. If you don't want to spend so much time re-indexing, you're going to want to back up your search indexes as well. It's easier if you're using Elasticsearch or Solr to make these things happen. Again, re-indexing can take quite a long time. So if you are able to back it up and restore from it, that's going to save you some time. More of a sysadmin topic, if you're coming from something like Elasticsearch, for example, and it's in a clustered environment, what ends up happening is the indexes are duplicated or replicated. So if that's the case, you're going to have to back up those as well. So first part's the database. Next up is going to be your file system, right? Again, you're going to want to back up Liferay Home. So some things in Liferay Home that are of consideration is going to be your property files. So you're going to have portal.ext and portal setup wizard.properties. So those are the two most important things within Liferay Home, right? If you have information over in the data folder, make sure to back that up as well, right? If you're using default settings, Liferay will store your documents and media into the data folder, but if you've configured that to point elsewhere, make sure that you have grabbed that and backed it up wherever it might be. So source code, right? It should go without saying that you should be using some sort of version control, whether it's SVN, whether it's Git, whether it's anything in between. You should be using some form of source control to keep track of the changes that you've made to your code. So if you got that, then for the most part, you're going to be fine. If not, you should be adopting that now if you haven't done so already. Again, I know I've already mentioned this, but right, you're going to want to always test and make sure that you can restore from your backup, right? A backup is no good if you can't restore from it. So make sure that you are able to, right? You want to be able to restore your database, restore Liferay, especially Liferay Home, since everything is there, and anything else that you may want to test out. So let's start with the database. Now, we could just pick up the database, back it up, and then call it good, but we can do a little bit of trimming beforehand. Right. With the database upgrade, this is probably going to be one of the most time-extensive steps, one of the most complex steps, and this is where if things go south, we're going to be very thankful for the backup. But before we go and back it up, there's a couple things that you may want to do. First thing is you're going to take a look at your database and see, are there things that you're able to clean up? Now, most of the time, we at Liferay don't recommend you knowing all of the ins and outs of the database. It might get you in trouble, but at least just know a little bit. So we're going to take a look at the database and see if there's anything we can clean up along the way. So as we're taking a look, there's going to be two things that are most important when we take a peek. The first one is going to be the records per table, and then second one is going to be the size per table. Though not as important, it's still relevant here, right? We want to know how big these are. Are they taking up huge amounts of space? Is there some places where we can sort of cut the unnecessary? So obviously the bigger the numbers, the more taxing it's going to be on our upgrade process. So of course, the first question that's going to come up is, well, how do we take a look, right? You may have various tools like the MySQL Workbench or anything in between. What we have here are a couple of Groovy scripts that'll let us take a look at these things here specifically. So we'll go through a formal exercise of this pretty soon. I'll just kind of walk through and talk through what this is going to be. So we're going to have a Groovy script, right? We're going to enter it in Liferay, and what it's going to do is print out the information about our database. It'll show us all of the relevant tables as well as the number of records within those tables as well. So that's going to be one of our exercises. We'll take a look at that a little bit later. So once we have a look of that, there's the second part of cleaning up things that we no longer need, right? When we take a look, right, we might have these sort of big numbers and we want to do a little bit of cleaning, but we want to make sure that the things that we clean are indeed no longer of use to us. We don't want to accidentally delete something and find out later that it was indeed needed and now Liferay is broken. So the big things are going to be in the realm of web content and documents and what we call orphan data. Let's start with the first one. So let's say, for example, I've been creating web content. I have a nice banner that shows up on my site page. And we've gone through a number of iterations, right? Maybe we've gone through 4 different versions of that banner, and those other 3 versions are still saved in Liferay, but I have no use for them. So we can clean those up, right? We don't need those other 3 versions of the banner. This is the same story with things like documents. Again, maybe we went through some revisions of a very important document, but we no longer need those previous versions, right? If that's the case, then we can delete them. So that's the first kind of data that we can get rid of. The second kind is orphan data. So these are things that when we delete something, that data remained for one reason or another. So things like portlet preferences or non-existing pages. Liferay might think there's a page there, but in reality there isn't. So we need to clean that up to let Liferay know, hey, nothing's there. So in the database, when we do that exercise, you'll see tables such as journal article and resource permission and portlet preferences. Typically, these are going to be the heavy hitters. This is where a lot of our data is going to be residing. Let's talk a little bit more about some other things that we are able to clean up. So we can go through the UI itself, heading over to Liferay's control panel and clean some of these things up ourselves. So in the UI, you can take a look and see, hey, are there any pages that I may have created as a test that I no longer need? Are there any tags or categories that I created that are not being implemented or used, right? Maybe I created some custom fields and, well, it turns out I didn't really need them, right? Again, sometimes some things can sneak into our Liferay instance as we're doing our testing, right? Maybe something remained. You might have that random web content just kind of hanging out, right? So those are some of the things we can take care of from the UI side, right? Again, behind the scenes in the database, there might be some other things like resource permissions or portlet preferences, for example. So if you're using specific pages or layouts that you, of course, need, you can keep them, but maybe you've created a page template that is no longer of service to you. Again, you can delete those as well. Right? As you do, there's a lot of other things that are being deleted, whatever the case is. What are some other things we can clean up? Things like roles. Again, we might have created a test role and we don't need to test out that role anymore. Or maybe there's some roles that we just don't need. You can get rid of those. Same with users. Again, we might need to delete users. Liferay does have the ability to inactivate a user. So if we have inactive users, both in the literal sense, or maybe someone who just doesn't use Liferay anymore, we can get rid of them. I just want to make sure that you do have the authorization to do so. We talked about this one earlier, document versions. Again, if you are keeping track of a document, it's been revised or edited multiple times, Liferay will keep track of those changes. So if you need to get rid of them, you can. Same with web content. If you're using categories, right, we keep them in what's known as a vocabulary. So if you are not using any vocabularies, then you can get rid of those as well, and the categories that go with it. When we're dealing with orphan data, right, this is data, once again, that's not connected to anything in Liferay, right? So we should get rid of these since they are floating, they're orphaned. So some common orphan data that may exist within Liferay. DL file entries, right? This is, Liferay pointing to something, but it's not actually there. So we can get rid of those entries there. Resource permissions, these go along with specific things in Liferay in order to keep track of permissions. So if something gets deleted, but the resource permission doesn't get deleted along with it, then it's stuck, it's not there anymore. So we want to make sure there's no floating or orphaned resource permissions. Portlet preferences, again, portlet preferences are created along with our portlet. It stores some info that we can grab from it. So when the portlet goes away, we also want to get rid of the portlet preferences that goes along with it. These are kind of the common ones here, right? But of course, there are others as well that you might need to take account for. So how do we clean up some of this data, right? We talked about some of the data that we should clean up, but how do we clean some of it up? One of the easy ways is going to the UI and just deleting it, right? You can delete users, sites, pages, and so on through the UI or the control panel of Liferay. So if you have that ability to do so, and there are some easy things in the UI that you can delete, by all means go for it. If not, you're going to want to use Liferay APIs, right? Liferay APIs will account for everything that we might not think of. So for example, if I delete a user, Liferay is also going to delete the resource permission along with it. Sometimes I might not think about that all the time. If I delete the user from the database, I also have to delete the resource permission. So we can see how there might be that disconnect. We might accidentally orphan that resource permission. If we're using Liferay APIs, right, the API will consider that and take care of that for us as well. So all of that to say, if you're going to be deleting things not through the UI, you're going to be using Liferay APIs. Whether you write a script to call the APIs or you create a portlet to call the APIs, you always want to call Liferay APIs to take care of the things behind the scenes programmatically. Right? We will never touch the database and delete entries using our SQL statements. Again, we can miss things. We might not know the complete relationship between our different tables, so we don't want to leave that to chance. The APIs will take care of that for us. So always use the APIs, right? So do not touch the database yourself, right? Go through another means. And once we go through all of the deleting and cleaning up, we're going to want to test Liferay to make sure that everything is still working the way that it is. Otherwise, we might carry a problem along into our upgraded environment. So we're going to go through another exercise, but first let's talk through what that exercise is going to be. We're going to use a Groovy script, and that Groovy script is going to be looking for documents within a specific site. It's going to look at a document and then see, does it have older versions? If it does, it'll then delete it. So that's going to be sort of the long story short of that exercise. We'll go through one other exercise here. It'll basically do more or less the same thing. It's going to look for web content in a specific site. We can hone in even further and look inside a specific folder. If there's web content there, we can then delete the web content's older versions. So we'll be taking a look at those exercises a little bit later. So far we backed up everything that needs to be backed up. We did a little bit of cleanup, things like the database and so on. Last thing is we're going to be working with our Liferay instance directly. So finally we get to do some work on Liferay. So first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to make sure that Liferay is as up to date as it can, right? So if we're running in 6.2, right, we're going to want to make sure that all of the patches for 6.2 that we have access to have been applied, right? If we're going again from a previous version like 6.0 or 6.1, we got to get up to that 6.2 version first. Next up is once we have our Liferay 6.2 up to date, we're going to want to do a little bit of investigation and see what are some of the changes between 6.2 and DXP in regards to things like properties and configurations. If you've looked at Liferay DXP, you'll see that not only are there different frameworks, but there's also a lot of changes in how properties and configuring Liferay has been done. So you want to see, am I using a property in 6.2 that is implemented differently over in DXP? Right, so you want to do some double checks over there. So again, right, if you're in the 6.2 world, make sure that everything is as up to date as it can be in 6.2 before progressing on and upgrading to DXP. Right, again, if you're in a lower version, you want to get up to 6.2. That way you'll reduce the number of errors that you're going to run into. We do have documentation here that shows the upgrade process to 6.2. So if you got questions there, go ahead and take a look. So first off, we want to patch up Liferay. Depending on what style or version of Liferay we're running, either enterprise or community, there's a couple of different things we need to consider. If you're in the enterprise edition of Liferay, you want to be on the most up-to-date service pack. If you're on the community edition of Liferay 6.2, you're going to want to be on the most recent GA release. So you want to double check those things before hitting the upgrade process. In regards to our properties in Liferay 6.2, again, a lot has changed. Some properties have been removed from portal properties. So some of the properties that you may be well accustomed to in the Liferay 6.2 world are no longer there in Liferay 7.1. So if you have your Liferay 7.1 instance up and running, you want to do a quick check on some of the legacy properties to ensure that whatever changes have been made, whatever conversions that you need to be done, and whatever properties have remained are still going to work. So if you do a dive into Tomcat Web Apps root inside of the webinf followed by the classes folder, you're going to find all of the old properties or the legacy property files so that you can do a little bit of compare and contrast. So here in the 6.2, right, you're going to take a look at that properties file and you're going to do a comparison to the DXP. One example is organization types back in the 6.2 world have regular organization and location, whereas in Liferay DXP, we only have regular organizations, right? So we're going to want to do those comparisons to ensure that our functionality is going to continue on. So if we are using locations in 6.2, for example, we're going to want to add those in the portal ext in our up-to-date version. Right, so one of the big changes here in Liferay DXP is a new way of configuring some of the settings. We call this the configuration API behind the scenes, or a new section called system settings in the UI. So a lot of what used to happen in portal ext has been migrated over to this system settings paradigm. Not everything, but there's a good amount over there. So again, you're going to want to do a review of the system settings to see, are there any things that are over there instead of in portal properties? So you're going to want to keep that in mind. We have other courses that kind of go into that in much more detail. To give a long story short, you can configure some properties in the UI of Liferay. They happen automatically or as quick as they can. No need to restart. You can then export those settings into a config file, and then you can migrate that config file into other instances of Liferay by placing it in that specific directory, OSGI config. That's sort of the long story short. So let's wrap this up and let's summarize some of the things that we have discussed here. Again, the most important is going to be backing up Liferay. You're going to want to make sure that Liferay is backed up and everything that goes with it. Database, property files, file system, your source code, and kind of the list goes on if you have other things in consideration. So make sure you back up, make sure you can restore from the backup. Next up, right, we're going to be preparing our database. You're going to want to do a little bit of house cleaning in the database, getting rid of data that's no longer of use and orphan data. So things like web content or resource permissions that have gotten left off. And then finally, we need to prep Liferay itself. We want to make sure Liferay is patched up to the latest service pack or GA release, depending on which Liferay version we're using. And we want to make sure we're up to Liferay 6.2. Once there, we want to do a comparison or a diff between the properties in 6.2 in the portal properties and the properties in 7.1. A lot has changed between 6.2 and 7.1. We want to make sure that we are accounting for those changes. So with all that being said, I've given you a lot to think about here. So I want to thank you again for spending time here on this video, and I'll see you in the next video.